Hi everyone, my name is Anya and the title of my presentation today is Potential Exists to Improve Ewe Mothering Ability and Lamb Vigour Through Breeding. Here in Ireland, for the majority of sheep production at least, we operate a mid-season lambing system where ewes lamb indoors in February and March and ewes and lambs are then ready to go out on grass in line with the grass growth curve. The graph here on the slide shows the different labour requirements throughout the sheep farming year. In January and February, there is a slight increase in labour requirement where ewes are being housed before lambing. This usually takes place between 6 weeks and 8 weeks prior to lambing. Lambing then occurs between mid-February and mid-April, and we see a huge spike in the labour requirement. The labour requirement then decreases throughout the year, and you can see only about 7% of labour is required at weaning in June, and even less is required at mating around October. So obviously the major labour requirement occurs at lambing, where over 25% of all labour requirement throughout the sheep farming year is required. Labour is a substantial cost to the farmer, and therefore it stands to reason that anything that reduces labour at lambing should be investigated. That's when we think about traits like ewe mothering ability and lamb vigour. If we can breed ewes that are more attentive and more protective of their lambs, and their lambs in turn stand and suckle quickly after birth, then we can potentially reduce the time spent per ewe, which can contribute to reduction in the labour requirement at lambing. We obviously don't want to be intervening and trying to get ewes to show interest in her lambs or to encourage lambs to stand and suckle. So our first trait is lamb vigour, and this is measured as the time taken for a lamb to stand immediately post birth. It's measured on a 5-point scale where 1 is very poor and 5 is very, very good. So a lamb with a score of 1 takes at least an hour to stand, while a lamb with a score of 5 is standing up and seeking to suckle within just 5 minutes after birth. Ewe mothering ability is similar to lamb vigour in that it is also measured on a 5-point scale, where 1 is very poor mothering ability and 5 is very good mothering ability. Here, mothering ability is measured depending on the ewe's behaviour towards her lambs. So a ewe with a score of 1 shows absolutely no interest in her lambs, whereas a ewe with a score of 5 is very protective, she licks her lambs immediately, follows the lambs closely and is vocal towards her lambs. If we then look at some data, so all of the data used in the present study was available from Sheep Ireland, which is the central database for sheep here in Ireland. Both lamb vigour and ewe mothering ability are producer scored traits, and we have records available on both flock book recorded animals and commercial crossbred animals. After edits were applied to the data, we were left with 21,826 ewe mothering ability records on 15,324 ewes, as well as 44,619 lamb vigour records. If we then take a look of the prevalence of each score for both traits, you can see that the majority of animals had a score of 4 or 5 for both lamb vigour and ewe mothering ability, remembering that score 4 and 5 is a score of good and very good respectively. Only 4.2% of lambs had a poor or very poor score for lamb vigour, while just 3.1% of ewes had a score of very poor or poor for ewe mothering ability. So we considered a number of risk factors for both traits. The risk factors that both traits had in common were heterosis, recombination, contemporary group, and the breed proportion of the animal. Contemporary group for both traits was defined as an interaction between the flock of lambing, the fortnight of lambing, and the year of the birth event. Other factors that were considered for ewe mothering ability included parity, ewe age, the difference in body condition score between mating lambing, the number of lambs born, and the age at first lambing. Here in Ireland, ewes lamb down for the first time at either 1 or 2 years of age. Additional factors considered for lamb vigour were sex, the age of the dam, the parity of the dam, the litter size, the breed proportion of the dam, the heterosis of the dam, and the recombination of the dam. Here we look at the sire prevalence for poor lamb vigour. The graph shows the prevalence of poor lamb vigour among different sires. So the prevalence of poor lamb vigour runs along the x-axis, while the number of sires runs along the y-axis. For the purpose of the graph, poor lamb vigour is defined as animals with a score of 1, 2 or 3, meaning that it took the lamb at least 30 minutes to stand after birth. In total, there are 309 sires included in this graph, and each of these sires had at least 30 progeny recorded for lamb vigour in at least 2 flocks. By identifying sires that had progeny in at least 2 flocks, we can remove some of the management factors. So if we look at some of the extremes, we can see that 14 sires had progeny where none of these lambs had poor lamb vigour. They all had a score of 4 or 5, meaning that the lambs were standing and seeking to suckle within 10 minutes after birth. Conversely, on the right side of your screen, there was one sire where it took 90% of his progeny at least 30 minutes to stand after lambing. And obviously, these are not the kind of sires that we would ideally be using if we're trying to improve lamb vigour. So as you can see here from the graph, there are a huge difference in the performance of sires in terms of lamb vigour. This graph is the same as the previous slide, but in this case it shows the sire prevalence of poor mothering ability rather than poor lamb vigour. Again, lots of similarities with the previous slide. The prevalence of poor mothering ability runs along the x-axis, while the number of sires runs along the y-axis. Again, similar to the previous slide, poor mothering ability is defined as a score of 1, 2 or 3, so the ewe showed very little interest in her lambs, or she was at least moderately attentive towards her lambs, but still not the ideal ewe. In total, there are 150 sires included in this graph, and each of these sires has at least 30 daughters that lambed in at least 2 different flocks. And again, similar to the previous slide, the reason that we selected sires with daughters in more than one flock was so that we could remove some management factors. Again, we can see that there's considerable differences between sires for poor mothering ability. And if we just again identify the extremes, for 2 sires, all of their daughters were good mothers and were attentive and protective towards their lambs. And then conversely, again highlighted on the right side of your screen, there was one sire where 60% of his daughters were poor mothers that showed little interest in their lambs. And as we know, if we're, lambing ewes ourselves, these are the ewes, the poorer mothers that we're having to spend a lot more time with, which is eating into the labour requirements. If we then look at some of the results for the present study, the risk factors that were identified for young mothering ability included ewe age, lambing difficulty, and the number of lambs born. So for example, in terms of ewe age, the older ewes were more likely to have a higher mothering ability score, so they were more likely to be better mothers, and this is understandable when we attribute it towards experience. In the case of lambing difficulty, ewes that experienced a more difficult birth were more likely to have a poorer mothering ability score, again, which I think is quite understandable. If we look at the risk factors identified for lamb vigour, these included litter size, lambing difficulty, dam age, birth weight and sex. And if we just highlight lambing difficulty, as it's quite similar to what we saw with ewe mothering ability. So lambs that experienced a more difficult birth were more likely to have a lower lamb vigour score, meaning that those that had a more difficult birth just took a little bit longer to stand up and start seeking to suckle. If we then look at some of the heritability estimates for each of the traits, which were determined by linear mixed models, mothering ability had a heritability of 6%, while the heritability of lamb vigour was much higher at 41%. Now, to be completely honest, I was very, very surprised that the heritability of lamb vigour was this high, and I repeated my analysis quite a few times to show that it wasn't going to change. But when I looked at some of the previous literature, the estimate for lamb vigour that we have here is in line with those previously seen. So if we think about all of this information in terms of a breeding goal, we all know that when considering a trait for inclusion in a breeding goal, it must fulfill three key criteria. The first of these is that the trait must be socially or economically important. We've seen that both lamb vigour and ewe mothering ability could contribute to a reduction in the labour required at lambing, which could be a significant economic saving for the farmer. The second criterion is that the trait must exhibit genetic variation, and we've seen from the variation in the sire prevalence graphs for both traits and the heritability estimates for both traits that both ewe mothering ability and lamb vigour exhibit genetic variation. The final criterion is that the trait must be measurable on a large scale. Here in Ireland, we have thousands of records for both traits, primarily over the last 5 years. So it stands to reason that both lamb vigour and ewe mothering ability also meet this requirement. Lamb vigour and ewe mothering ability fulfil each of the criteria here required for the inclusion of a trait in a breeding goal. And here in Ireland, we are now looking at the possibility of including both ewe mothering ability and lamb vigour in our breeding goal for Irish sheep. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the Smarter project and its collaborators, and thank you all so much for your attention.